Thanks so much, and thank you, Freddie. That was incredibly encouraging, was it not? Well, this morning we talked about the church, and there's one thing I don't think I mentioned, which is my team and I have put together an outreach assessment. And if you're interested, you can find it at churchoutreachassessment.com. And what you can do, you can fill it out yourself, you can share it with your team, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of how positioned your particular congregation is to reach the next generation. Free assessment, churchoutreachassessment.com. So tonight we talked about the church, or this morning we talked about the church. Tonight I want to talk about you, and this one's deeply personal. So I shared a little bit of my story about starting out at 30 years old in these three little churches. And what I didn't tell you is that the churches grew rather rapidly. And I ended up leading one of the fastest growing, the fastest growing church in the country in our denomination, and it soon became one of the largest. And on the outside, I was super excited about that, probably for some very unhealthy reasons, and a few healthy reasons as well. But what happened to me, I never saw it coming. If we had a conversation in the spring of 2006, and you asked me how it was going, I would have said it was going incredible. Our church was growing very rapidly. We had just moved out of the buildings into an elementary school and just completed construction on a brand new facility. We were seeing growth pretty much every month. Every single Sunday, there were new people in the church. And in many ways, I felt like I was on top of the world. In fact, I'd gotten to know some leaders in Atlanta, Georgia, and I became friends with a guy named Reggie Joyner. And he introduced me to his boss, who at the time was Andy Stanley. And Andy and Reggie invited me to speak at a conference at North Point. And so in the spring of 2006, they flew me down, my wife, my two boys who were teenagers at the time, and I'll never forget it. It was the biggest talk of my life to date. There were 2,500 leaders from around the world. Reggie Joyner was in the front row. My wife and my boys were in the front row. Andy Stanley was sitting right over there in the front row. And I got up, and it felt like the Super Bowl. Like all of a sudden, I'm starting quarterback doing a keynote address at the Super Bowl. And by all accounts of everybody in the room that day, the talk went incredibly well. And I felt invincible. And we left Atlanta, we flew home, and when the plane landed in Toronto, it's like I fell off a cliff. And I'm not one who's given to depression. I'm a pretty optimistic person. But all of a sudden, my energy just completely disappeared. I probably fit within a few weeks the bill for clinical depression. I had no idea what was going on. I lost my joy. I lost my passion. I didn't lose my faith. I intellectually believed that Jesus is who he said he is, but I couldn't feel it anymore. My prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling. I'm a pretty productive person, but I had almost no ability to write, to think. I had incredible brain fog. I was tired beyond description. And I thought, okay, you're really, really tired. You've been running hard for a decade. Prior to that, you were 10 years in school. You must just be exhausted. And so I took the month of July off. The crash started in May. I made it through June. In July, I took 3 weeks off, and I thought, all right, let's just see. I'll probably get better. And at the end of 3 weeks off, where I did almost nothing, it didn't get better. It got worse. And that's when I knew something was broken. And I went back to our elders, and I have great elders. And I just said, hey, I need you to know I'm broken. I don't know how I'm broken. I don't know why I'm broken. I don't know what happened. But it's not going well. And they said, well, do you want a sabbatical? And I said, I feel like I need one, but I think if I take one, I'm never coming back. And I said, so I don't think that would be a very good idea. But would you just know I'm really wounded right now. I'm going to counseling. I'm trying to get help. And I'm just going to limp through this next season. And in August, I probably hit bottom. I think I spent August sleeping, paying off sleep debt, and crying, just mourning ungrieved loss after ungrieved loss going back to childhood. And at one point, I don't know, there's some of you who are there, whether you've ever been there, I began to think that the only way out was out. That maybe the best thing to end the pain would be to end my life. Now, fortunately for me, I'm a Canadian and I don't own any weapons. So that becomes difficult, when you don't own weapons. It's like, what, a butter knife? Like, I'm going to use a butter knife? Like, how do I do this? So I didn't, but I'll tell you, the pain is real. And I just kind of moved through it. Counseling, prayer, rest, grieving my losses. And by September, the first little tiny flicker of light began to appear again. I remember talking to someone about the mission of our church, and for the first time, I felt it. And I'm like, there it is, a little glimmer of hope. And within a few months, I was maybe back to 60 or 70%. And by 2007, the next year, maybe 70 or 80%. But it took me 3 to 5 years to find a new normal. And 16 and a half years on the other side of burnout, I've never burned out again. And by the grace of God, I think he was reconstructing in me a much more solid spiritual base and a much more solid life base so that he was preparing me for the season that I'm in now. But I talk to leaders every single week who are exhausted. And I didn't even need a pandemic to burn out. I mean, you guys have been through a pandemic. You've been through the most unpredictable years of church life that I can imagine. And even long before I started ministry, I spent a year in law in downtown Toronto. And I remember running into lawyers, and I worked in sort of the Wall Street of Toronto. The bank towers, highly successful people, made a boatload of money. I didn't, because I was low person on the totem pole. But I mean, my goodness. I mean, they had so many Lexuses, they had Lexi. You know the kind of lawyers I'm talking about? And it's like, what is going on here? And they made so much money, and they were miserable. They were miserable. And as I run into church leaders, it's like, nobody made you do this, right? Like, you answered a call. But here's what I've discovered. That most leaders are overwhelmed, overcommitted, and overworked doing exactly what they thought they wanted to do with their lives. And I want to talk to those of you who are in that position tonight. And if you're not in that position, I promise you there are people in your church who are in that position. Maybe you've got kids or grandkids who are in that position. The first time I gave a talk on burnout, probably 10 years ago in Atlanta, I prefaced it by saying, hey, a lot of you are younger in the audience. It was a pretty young crowd. I said, if you're under 40, this talk isn't going to make any sense. Just take some notes, store them away, and when you're 40 and burn out, take them out. And when that talk was over, I had a long line almost to the back of this room of college students and adults in their 20s going, me as well. Me as well. It's an epidemic. Did you know that 70% of adults in their 20s and 30s say they are experiencing some level of burnout? 70%. Think about it. Think about everybody that you pass in the store, anybody who shows up to worship, people you meet at some concert. 70% of them self-identify as saying, yeah, some level of burnout in the last year. A Deloitte study done in the middle of 2021 said 82% of senior executives, and you might substitute pastors in this, regularly finish work feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. In other words, I gave it all at the office. I gave it all to my laptop. When I shut the laptop, when I drove home, I had nothing left to give my wife and give my kids. And you know the Barna stat by now. Earlier this year, 42% of pastors, 42%, almost 1 in 2 pastors said, I'm thinking not of leaving my church, but I'm seriously thinking of quitting ministry. And over the last 2.5 years, how many people actually did? Legions. So this is not sustainable, and I want to talk to you about how to live at a more sustainable pace and how to stop living at an unsustainable pace. What I did in the 3 to 5 years that I was recovering from burnout after 2006 was I became a student of my life, a student of productivity, a student of how do I make sure this never happens again to me? Because once you burned out, it is so painful and so dark, you never want to go back there, and you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. And so I read books, and I got coaching, and I listened to podcasts, and I did whatever I could. And what I'm sharing with you in the next 30 minutes is just a little toe in the water, some really practical strategies I hope can help you. And then I'm going to direct you to a resource where, again, we have a free burnout assessment and some more teaching materials that'll follow up on what I'm sampling tonight. But I want to talk to you about the problem, and then we'll get to the solution. You know what I said for years? Every time somebody said, hey, because all through my 30s, looking back on it, I was around 40 when I burned out. All through my 30s, as the church grew, and I had a terrible math equation. My math equation was this: more people equals more hours. If God sends me more people, I'm just going to work more hours. I don't know how else to do it. I don't know how else to scale it. And it just didn't work. And people would say, Carey, you seem really tired, or, be careful, you're going to burn out. And I always thought, well, burnout's for weak people. But you know what I would say to myself? It's just a busy season. You ever say that to yourself? Just a busy season, just a busy season. But then last spring was a busy season, and the summer was a busy season, and the fall was a busy season, and now we're coming into Christmas. And finally the jig was up, and I realized seasons have beginnings and seasons have endings. And if your busy season has no ending, it's not a busy season, it's your life. And we got to stop making excuses. I tried to figure out, okay, well, what is it? What is it about life today that makes things so complicated? And I want you to watch the screens and take a look at what I diagrammed out. It's called the stress spiral. And if you talk to most leaders today, here's what they'll tell you. I'm overwhelmed, I'm overcommitted, and I'm overworked. And that's how it feels. That's how ministry feels. We should add underpaid to that as well. I'm overwhelmed, I'm overworked, and I'm overcommitted. And if you think about it, it's probably, and this is what happened to me, is I was mismanaging the three principal assets that God gives us every day. If you think about what does every person get, what does every leader get? Three assets: time, energy, and priorities. And when I was in the stress spiral, when my life was spiraling out of control, and in those moments where it threatens to do it right now, here's what's happening. My time is not focused. I don't think about managing my energy, and I allow my priorities to get hijacked by other people. And that's what happens in the stress spiral. You end up overworked, overwhelmed, and overcommitted because you don't focus your time, you don't leverage your energy, and you let other people hijack your priorities. So the question is, well, how do you solve the stress spiral? How do you solve it? And the answer most of us have looks something like this image on the screen. It's like, oh, just get me to my next vacation. Get me to some Caribbean island. Get me to some resort. Get me to some all-inclusive. Get me to the ocean. Get me wherever. But I'll go there, and everything will be okay. And the problem is, how many times have you come back from an incredible vacation? When you get back from an incredible vacation, Monday morning by 11 a.m., it felt like you were never away and you got hit by the bus. You ever have that experience? It's like you're so relaxed on Sunday, back into the office Monday, bam, what happens? And finally I put my finger on it. You know what it is? Time off won't heal you when the problem is how you spend your time on. That's why you've seen so many pastors, and maybe this has been you, took a 4-month sabbatical, a 6-month sabbatical. You could be living on a villa in the south of France, looking over the Mediterranean, having the most amazing time of your life for 4 months, feel totally rejuvenated. You go back into ministry, and Tuesday, boom, you're roadkill again. Why is that? Because the problem, you guys know how to vacation. I had to figure out how to vocation. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know, because when I was off, I was okay. I could close the laptop. I could figure that out. So, vacation and time off and even sabbaticals are not the cure for an unsustainable pace. You know what I've had to figure out and live by over the last decade? A sustainable pace is the solution for an unsustainable pace. So you got the stress spiral on one side, but I want to show you something completely different. What about a thrive cycle? If you start to take the three principal assets you have every day and I have every day, and start doing some little tweaks, actually some pretty big tweaks, easy to understand, hard to implement, and I want to walk us through them tonight. Instead of having unfocused your time, start focusing your time. Instead of ignoring your energy levels, other than to say you're tired, start leveraging your limited energy. And finally, start realizing your priorities by refusing to let other people hijack them. So, I want to give you some really practical advice. First thing, there's lots of time management books out there, lots of great time management books, but stop just managing time. Thing that I was really good at when I burned out was time management. I read the books, I was super efficient, I was ready to go, but the volume of responsibility that I had as a leader in that first decade just kept growing and growing and growing, and efficiency doesn't solve that. And after I burned out, I finally admitted to myself, you know what? I mean, this is obvious. I'd known this my whole life, but I never really thought about it. Every single leader gets the same amount of time every day. All through my 30s, people kept saying, Carey, you got to write a book. You got to write a book. And you know what I would say? I don't have time to write a book. I barely have time for dinner. I barely have time for sleep. I definitely do not have time to write a book. And then finally, after my burnout, it hit me, no, everybody who's ever published a book has the same amount of time every day that I do. Anyone who's hit the New York Times bestseller list had 24 hours in a day. You ever look at like somebody who leads a bigger church and go, how do you get it done? And you think, is God giving them an 8th hour, like an 8th day, or like a 25th hour? And the answer is no. In fact, when you meet the really great leaders, you know what's eerie? They seem so focused on you, and they don't seem rushed, and they have the exact same amount of time as you do. So I thought, well, what do I do with that? And so I came up, there's a lot of great books on time management. I want to give you one little hack tonight. Stop saying you don't have the time. Just stop saying you have the time, because you do. You have the same amount of time as Rick Warren. You have the same amount of time as anybody else in this room. The only exception to that is the day you're born and the day you die, and let's assume that those don't apply today. So you've got that amount of time. You got the same amount of time. And so what I started doing, see if this might work for you. I started admitting, I stopped saying I didn't have the time, and I started admitting I didn't make it. And so when I decided not to make a start on a book, I just said, you know what? It's not that I didn't have the time to write the book. I didn't make it. It's not that I didn't have the time to do a great job on message prep this week. I just didn't make it. And that became such a powerful hack because it made me realize, like, you think about it. Let's say your mom wants to get together with you, and you've been putting it off for a month. And what are you saying to your mom? It's like, yeah, Mom, I just don't have the time to get together this week. I just don't have the time to get together this week. Sorry, Mom, maybe next week. Nope, didn't have the time. It's like eventually, if you start saying to yourself, I didn't make the time, it changes things. There's that friend you've wanted to get together with, right? It's like, yeah, we just don't have the time to get together. I don't have time for that text. Don't have time for that phone call. Well, eventually you realize you have the same amount of time as anybody else. Some of you, you're so time-starved. How many of you have young kids at home? I've met a few of you. Anybody? Yeah, a few of you? All right. Have you ever had, if you have a toddler like a 2 or 3-year-old, have you ever been so time-famished that when you're reading a bedtime story, you skip a page? You ever done that as a parent? Mm-hmm. You know what's really frustrating? When your 2-year-old says, Mommy, you skipped a page, and you're like, you can't even read. Like, what is wrong with you? But they know. And what is that? Like, wouldn't it be great to be in a place where you're just like, I didn't make time, not to make anybody feel guilty, but I just didn't make the time to properly read to my kids today. Now, this hack alone hasn't done it for me, but since I started admitting I didn't make the time to write a book, I've written 5. I didn't have the time to launch a podcast. I've launched 3 or 4. It's like, what? You've got the time. You just didn't make it. So here's the hack. Walk away from this place and start saying, I didn't make the time. Now, this works 2 ways. Because you know those people who always want your time? You can start saying to yourself, I'm not going to make the time to have lunch with him. I'm not going to make the time, because it's a trade-off, right? If you go to lunch with him, you're probably not having dinner with your spouse in a focused way. Now, be very careful how you use this, because you want to use your inside voice, not your outside voice. Right? If I call you, it's like, hey, you want to have lunch Friday? And you're like, I'm not making time for that. You're going to have no friends by next month. So keep that on the inside, but just start admitting, hey, I didn't make the time. It's been so helpful to me. I mean, with everything from my fitness journey to time with my wife to time off in the summer, it's like I'm going to make the time for that because that actually matters. So that's time. I want to dive into energy. You can stop admitting you didn't make the time, but start managing your energy. So every leader, we already talked about this, gets 24 equal hours in the day, but you know this already, they don't feel equal or produce equally. And we all know this because as part of our culture, we know morning person, night owl. So let's do a quick survey of those of you here tonight. How many of you are morning people? Hands up. Yeah, usually in a leadership audience, vast majority. How many of you are night owls? Hands up. Yeah, that's why you're at the evening session. How many of you are exhausted all day long, no matter what time it is? Kidding, that's a joke. Okay. See, there's something about that. It's your chronotype. And I wasn't a morning person, but I became one once I was married and had kids. And what I found is that not all hours produce equally for me. So I'm going to show you a chart, and this is my chronotype. This is my energy clock. And the day starts at noon. It's kind of weird, but follow along with it. I usually get up by 6 a.m., usually sometimes 5. And that first hour, kind of groggy, but you know, I'm waking up. My green zone, I divide the day into 3 zones, and you should do the same for yourself. Green, yellow, red. Green is when your energy is the highest. You know when you're writing a sermon, it just flows? You know when you're working on a report and it's like, oh, all the ideas are really coming to me? Where you're generally in a good mood, where you've got energy for the day. That's your green zone. And mine happens between 7 and 11 a.m. and again, briefly after lunch. Then you have the opposite time of day, and most of us have a couple hours like this. I call it your red zone. I was in my red zone this afternoon. Mine's between 4 and 6, and one of my team members called me in the hotel. He's like, do you have just a few minutes to talk? I'm like, yeah, I got a few minutes to talk. And he started asking me all these really big questions about what I wanted to do, and it was everything I could do to get through that meeting and just go, I have 3 brain cells left, okay? I can't make big decisions. Do you know when that is? For a lot of people, that's right after lunch. You know when you're so tired you need more caffeine or a nap? That's your red zone. You probably have an hour or 2 like that during the working day, and then everything else is yellow. It's neither high energy or super low energy. So you got the best of me this morning. You're getting the leftovers tonight. That's just the way it goes. And I wish when I was younger, I thought, I'm a robot, man. I'm going to drive through a concrete wall with my energy. And then eventually I hit it. And that was it. And I've talked to thousands of leaders about this. And even the most productive, most amazing leaders see this and go, oh, 100%. I'm best between 9 and 11 a.m. or 3 and 5 p.m. or whatever. And there's no right answer, whether you're a night owl or a morning person, or a lot of people actually peak midday, sometime between 1 and 4. It was funny because that meeting this afternoon, the impromptu meeting, was dueling green zones. I was in my red zone, he was in his green zone. So he's got all kinds of energy, and I'm like, sorry, what was that again? Like, it's just the way I am. And I had a nap in the afternoon so I could come back somewhat fresh for tonight. Now, what do you do with that? Well, you can cooperate with that, or you can compete with it. And competing with this reality got me burned out. Cooperating with it is the Archimedes lever for so many people, including myself. When I realized, the book that I wrote on this is called At Your Best. It came out last year. What I wanted to call it was the 3-hour workday. Now that title was taken, so to speak, but you think about it, I basically think of myself when I'm in like writing season, writing a sermon, writing a talk like this, I have about a 3-hour fuse. And once those hours are gone, I'm not as good as I was in my green zone. Now, the problem that I had for a lot of years was I gave away my green zone indiscriminately. If I'm best in the morning, you know what I did? I was the king of breakfast meetings. And you know how breakfast meetings go? Well, we'll meet at the restaurant at 7 a.m. You get there at 7 a.m. It's supposed to be done at 8, but it goes till 8:30. And then you're like, well, I better hit a drive-thru and grab some coffee before I go to the office. So you roll into the office at 9. You get into the office at 9, and then you chit-chat for a little while. And then someone says, hey, can I have 5 minutes of your time? You're like, okay, but it's never 5 minutes. It's more like 45 minutes. And then it's 10 o'clock. You're like, oh, I got 17 texts and I haven't checked my email. Then it's 11:30 and you're ready for lunch. And how much have you gotten done? Nothing. Nothing. So I decided I'm not doing breakfast meetings anymore because I'm burning jet fuel. Like if I've got a really big message coming up, I got to talk, I got a chapter due on a book, I got to churn that out. And if I try, writing at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. is not the same for me. I can write really well at 8 a.m. I'm horrible at 8 p.m. It just doesn't, well, we're already in that zone. There we are. So, as you can tell, performance is going down. But we're all human. And so you cooperate with that or compete with it. So what do you have to do? And this is, if there's one takeaway today, this is what to remember. When are you at your best? A lot of you are morning people. Some of you are night owls. Pay attention to this and take really careful notes because you're going to be able to pinpoint it probably to an hour. It's really at 7:30 or 8 a.m. that I come alive, and then I start to peter out by 11:30 a.m. Like just, it will repeat. And yes, the baby kept you up the night before, or you were out at a concert, or whatever. But normally in everyday life, you'll see these patterns repeat. Make note of them. And so then you know when you're at your best, and here's the secret. Do what you're best at when you're at your best. When I was a young leader, I thought I was awesome at everything. And now that I'm in my 50s, I'm like, I'm actually barely good at one thing. Like you have a very narrow bandwidth. So what are you best at? And as much as I thought I'm a great project manager, I'm not a great project manager. Like no one's getting fed if I'm in charge of the meal. It's just not happening. And I thought I was really good at graphic design, and then I met a graphic designer, and I had to put the clip art away, you know, and all those things. Like, and a lot of us, when you're part of a small church, like I told you this morning, you're a generalist. But you know what I realized I am? On my good days, I'm a communicator. I can write. I can deliver a talk most days. I can cast a clear and compelling vision. I can align a team around a mission. I can raise resources, and that's about it. Everything else, the skill set falls off a cliff really quickly. And I realized when I led the church, or even now when I lead my company, when I'm communicating clearly, when I'm thinking clearly, when I'm casting a clear and compelling vision, and when the team's aligned, we do great. When I take my eye off those things and give away my green zone, it starts to wobble. So what are you best at? What's your superpower? Some of you, it's spreadsheets. Awesome. I still don't know how to do that. Some of you, it's organizing projects. You love putting big events together. Some of you, it's communication. Some of you, it's pastoral care. I don't know what it is. But what if you did what you were best at when you're at your best? When I started to write in my green zone, my preaching hit a new level. I got to produce books. You become better at it, faster at it. And it gets better and better and better and better. So it's that blending of those three things: your gifting, your passion, and your impact. Your gifting, what did God enable you to do? Your passion, what do you love doing it? You know, some of you, when you're in your green zone as far as your tasks go, You look up and you're like, whoa, 3 hours went by? How did that go by so quickly? Other times you're in a meeting, it's like, whoa, how did 3 minutes feel like 3 hours? You've been in those things too. But you know you're in your green zone when time flies. You're like, you're in the flow. And this is the big part, it has to have an impact. Because you might think, like, I love cycling. I am not heading to the Tour de France anytime soon. There is zero impact from my cycling. But when I communicate well, there's impact. When I write well, there's impact. When I cast vision, there's impact. And I'm gifted for it, and most days I really enjoy it. If you can get those three going, you found your sweet spot. That's what you're best at. That's your superpower. And when you do it in your green zone, the results become exponential. Because you know this, right? If you start your sermon on Monday and you're done Tuesday at 10 a.m., does it really matter what happens for the rest of the week? No. Because you got the big tuna done. It's finished. And you're like, what you got? You got a crisis? Bring it. But if it's Thursday afternoon at 5:16 p.m. and you're like, now what am I talking about on Sunday? That's a very different weekend lined up. Do what you're best at when you're at your best. Give it your priority. So, back to your energy clock. When are you at your best? And then what you do is you start to sync up your clock with your tasks. So, I look at this. For me, my green zone, I spend that time writing, sometimes strategic thinking. We're doing a lot of strategic thinking right now. I'll do research. I'll try to figure out where the internet's going. I'll research that. And I'll do some talk preparation. I'll make sure I'm ready for a night like this or a morning like this morning. Or I'll polish things up or change things. My red zone, I do as little as possible. Emails, routine meetings, I've even cut those out since I built that slide. Not a good idea, because I make bad decisions. And then the next day I'm like, who thought of this? And my team says, you did. I'm like, when? 4 o'clock yesterday. I'm like, it's a terrible idea. So then we get rid of it. Or you know what, honestly, go have a nap. Amen. I love the charismatics, don't you? That's just great. We need some love around naps. Like, I was so sleep deprived as a young leader, and now I'm unapologetic. I track it. This is a smart ring, and I track it on my phone and my smartwatch. I know how much deep sleep I got, and I make sure. Like last night, I got 8 hours sleep because I knew today was going to be a big day, and tomorrow was not. I got a 3 a.m. wake-up call, but I'll make up for it on Thursday and Friday. I treat it like debt. If you get a little bit overdrawn, pay up, pay up, pay up, pay up now. And then yellow zone, you can do a lot of stuff in your yellow zone, not your best work. I have a podcast I'm fairly well known for. It's gone really well. I do the prep in my green zone. I do the interviews in my yellow zone. Why? Well, because it's a good time of day to talk to people. And if I've done my prep well, the interview is easy. If I've done bad prep, the interview is hard. So, just some ideas about it, but you'll have to do this for yourself, and we've got free resources I'll show you at the end to show you how to do that. But that leads us to the third idea, which is refuse to let your priorities get hijacked. So time, stop saying you don't have the time, start admitting you didn't make it. Energy, do what you're best at when you're at your best in your green zone. And then priorities. Here's the reality about life. No one will ever ask you to complete your top priorities. They will only ask you to complete theirs. Think about it. Every text you've ever gotten, every email, every phone call, every tap on the shoulder, you know what that is? That's someone else saying, hey, this is really important to me. Can you do it? Now, before you think that's pathological, you do the same thing to other people. That's how humans interact. If I text you or email you, I probably want something from you. But a lot of us get into that place where that's how we spend our whole lives. We spend it reactively, not proactively. So this is what you need to do. Decide how you will spend your time before others decide for you. And if you want to see this happen in real life, to know whether you're doing it or not, how many of you have had a day recently where you had nothing on the calendar? It's 8 a.m., you think this is going to be the most amazingly productive day in the history of days, and you sit down and you go to work, and 4:30 rolls around, and not only have you got nothing crossed off your to-do list, it grew. And you're like, how did this happen? You know what that is? You let other people determine how you are going to spend your time. So, if you open up your calendar, you can do this on your phone, and let's go to March 2023. You know what most people, even most leaders' calendar looks like? It looks something like this, blank. And this is the fallacy. Someone says, hey, can you join this advisory board? We're meeting next week. And you're like, nope, too busy. But then you look at March, and they say, well, what about March? And you're like, oh, great, I got a fantastic month in March. Yeah, let me put that on my calendar. And then what happens? You get to March, and March is just as busy as November is. Because if you went back to August, November looked amazing. But now you're in November, and it's a nightmare. Right? And how did that happen? It happens this way. You let other people decide how you're going to spend your time. So if you look at my calendar, I can show you March of 2023. I can show you March of 2024 or March of 2027. I already know what I'm doing. Because it looks like a totally different thing. Blank space on your calendar is a trap. It looks like freedom, but it's jail disguised as liberty. So a blank calendar is pretty much a guarantee that you'll spend your time on everyone else's priorities, not your own. So if you look at my calendar, it looks like this. Now, what that says, it's really small print. If you look at the free resource we'll give you, it'll have details about this. But I know that in March of 2023 or 2027, in the morning on Monday, I'll be writing. On Tuesday, I'll be doing some strategy, maybe some writing. I'll be doing some talk preparation on Wednesday. I'll be doing some writing on Thursday. I know that mid-afternoon, I'll be doing some meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Why have I pre-decided it? Because we all like to think we're super original, but our lives are amazingly routine. I know given what I do, I almost always have a writing project. Now, I don't know in March whether it'll be a book, a blog post, or what it will be, but I know I'm going to be writing. And those of you who work in churches, those of you who preach, you know that there's a sermon coming most Sundays. You figured that out by now. And it's like, oh, this is a pattern I should pay attention to. Well, if you write it in the calendar, ahead of time, this is amazing. And then somebody says to you, hey, can you meet Tuesday morning? You say, I'm sorry, I've got a commitment. The commitment is to yourself. Now, you'll notice the weekends are filled in. You know what the weekends say? Family and personal time, church, and then rest and recovery. So when somebody says to you, the worst words you can hear at a church gathering are, hey, what are you doing next Saturday? Because it's a trap, right? So you pull out your calendar, you look at it, next Saturday, let me look. You already know what it says, but this is the game you play. You say, oh, I have a commitment. And most people will leave it at that. Some people will say, well, what kind of commitment? And you say, I've got a commitment with my family. And if they ask you, is your family more important to you than me? You call the police. That's what you do. You have them taken out, all right? And then you go read a book by Henry Cloud and John Townsend on boundaries. I mean, people will ask you that, but very unhealthy people go there. Most healthy people will respect that, and you don't owe anyone an explanation. Do you know how many times I got trapped as a young dad going, oh, I'm sorry, on Saturday I got to go to this event I don't want to go to? Because I got trapped that way. I wish I knew this when my kids were young. I could have gotten a lot of days off back. Now, what happens if you really want to go to this event? You go. Go. That's great. Nobody's stopping you, but now you've got an out. And you've got a family life, and a personal life, and a hobby, and a marriage left at the end of the day. Now, sometimes people will say, well, that's great, Carey. You were a senior pastor. Now you run your own company. You get to call the shots. What do I do? So I pulled thousands of leaders on this. And I've asked them, all right, well, let's think about a work day. Okay, a typical work week's about 40 hours. And then I'll ask them this question. How much of those 40 hours would I call command performance hours? In other words, Staff meeting is Monday at 1 o'clock. Then we have leadership team meeting. Then we have a weekend service design meeting. Then we have rehearsal. Then we have this. The average answer is 5 to 12 of the 40 hours. But I want to show you a worst case scenario. For those of us who are information workers, knowledge workers, let's say it's 20 hours a week you have to be in meetings that you don't have any control over. Look at this pie chart. That's what you can't control in the red, but you can control 148 hours. You can control almost 90% of your time. And you're like, well, what about like soccer practice and cheer and baseball and all that stuff? Look, the government didn't make you do that. That was your choice, right? It's your choice to be out 7 nights a week. By the time I was done leading Connexus, I mean, in the early days, it was committee meetings. There were more people on committees than there were in the church. It was crazy. So finally, I shut it all down, and then by the time I was finished, we were running the biggest church we'd ever led. 3,000 or 4,000 people called it home. I was out 1 night a month. That's it. Now, if you really empower people and you really equip them and you set the church up to succeed without you, you can do that. But so many leaders are overwhelmed. There's a little mantra I adopted over a decade ago that I try to live by every day. And it's simply this: live in a way today that will help you thrive tomorrow. I got to get up at 3 or 3:30 tomorrow morning. So guess what I did? Got 8 hours sleep last night. Didn't plan anything when I got into town. I'll take some downtime on Friday. I got a lot to do tomorrow when I fly back to Toronto and a lot to do on Thursday, but I'll be okay. And then what do I plan for Saturday during the day? Nothing. What do we have planned after church Sunday? Some time for me and my wife. And we're back at it Monday. And I'm leading more people than I've ever led, and I feel better than I've ever felt. And that is my wish for you, to live in a way today that will help you thrive, not just survive tomorrow. So, we have a free resource if you're interested. You'll get a calendar template that you can plug right into iOS or Outlook. And also, we'll give you a burnout assessment. There's a lot more, and there's some more teaching videos. So if you're interested, just grab the QR code or text the words "at your best" to the number on the screen. And what I'd like to do tonight as we wrap up is just, first of all, say thank you. Thank you, you guys. It's been a super long day. I've loved hearing your stories during the breaks, and I'm so encouraged by what you're doing. But I want you to make it for the long haul. And so will you join me as we pray together? Lord, I thank you. There's almost 1,400 churches represented by this association. And so many represented by those in the room and those watching online. And Lord, if we're honest, some of us are just so tired. And thank you, Jesus, for your words that if we're tired and heavy laden, we can come to you. And I pray that you would give us rest. Give us more than rest, though, Lord. Give us life and life more abundant. And I pray, God, that we would be able to serve you in a way that shows the world that you have brought us life and life to the full. Revive our churches, revive us, raise up the next generation of leaders, and keep us fresh and celebrating until we see you face to face. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.